Thank you very much, Pam, for that scintillating introduction. Of course, the full story of my background is the gypsies stole me from my parents and then tried to return me after 5 days, but my parents wouldn't have me back. And I ended up in a career in sanitation, which is how I got involved in Theosophy, because I turned up at Gloucester Place and I said, "I've come to unblock your drains." And Lillian Story thought I'd said, "I've come from the inner planes." Anyway. So, where did the male mermaids come from? Madame Blavatsky, in The Key to Theosophy, after dismissing the claim that the masters were spirits, in quotation marks, or myths, again in quotation marks, so that's one in the eye for K. Paul Johnson, mentions that I once heard one outsider say to another that they were a sort of male mermaids, whatever such a creature may be. So, even she had no idea of what a male mermaid would look like, least of all in its Mahatmic incarnation. And although she reports the speech of outsiders, the fact that she felt the need to devote a section of her explanatory work to the subject suggests that there might have been some confusion even in Theosophical circles. The Key was published in 1889, some years after Mr. Sinnett had ceased to receive direct letters from the masters, and the communications he received via a succession of psychics did not always see eye to eye with HBB, to say the least. And more direct challenges to the authority of HBB and her teachers always ended up challenging the status, in one way or another, of the masters. Whether it was Anna Kingsford challenging the value of Eastern teachings compared to Western, or the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, not to be confused with the Brotherhood of Luxor of early New York days, posting advertisements in the occult press disparaging the success to be had with Eastern Mahatmas. The unity of the Theosophical movement was split asunder just a few years after HBB's comments in The Key, and although the Judge case is beyond the scope of this talk, that's the split between William Judge on the one hand and Ali Besant et al. On the other, although that's beyond the scope of this talk, we should note that the immediate cause of the breach was claims about the authority of Mahatma letters and disputes about how authentic communications were received. But even before the conflict saw the light of day, Judge had expressed disquiet about the quality of material psychically received and disseminated via the London Lodge of the Theosophical Society, of whom Sinnett and latterly Leadbeater were the principal teachers. The teachings we individually adopt in our daily lives and in our studies and so on are ultimately, in some degree, conditioned by the kind of teacher we are willing to listen to. If there is any truth to this last claim, it is borne out by the history of both the Agile movement, its various splinter groups, and the many new movements that sometimes invoke the names of Blavatsky's masters amongst many, many others. Daniel Caldwell, editor of the Blavatsky Archives website, lists a total of 13 clusters of claims about contact with this mysterious brotherhood, or some variant thereof, which founded our movement. And he does not claim that his list is exhaustive. And in modern times, by about now, I think there's probably several hundred variant claims, different teachers, whatever. And it's just happens to be the case that certain names crop up more often. But anyway, apart from the obvious characters, or perhaps I should say the usual suspects, Judge, Besant and Leadbeater, Peruka, Bailey, Helena Rurik, Guy Ballard, Steiner, to name a few, there are some perhaps less well-known names. Francia Ledoux of the Temple of the People, Nada Yolanda of Mark Age Inc. No, I'd not heard of that one either. Erling Cheney of Astra, and so on. Sometimes these different messages of the same ostensible brotherhood are virulently opposed to each other. That's something we're completely unfamiliar with in the Theosophical Society, obviously. Helena Roerich dismissed the Alice Bailey teachings as black magic, for example, and even instructed her followers on one occasion to tell the Bailey group that one of the Agni Yoga books was out of print so that they couldn't sell it to them. So sometimes we need to take a step back and view where this thread of claimed Mahatmic inspiration comes from and what the original teachings were, so we can compare it with later attempts or later claims to be expanding those teachings or to come from the same school. So, who were the masters? HPB, in the letters of Franz Hartmann, summarizes it thus. And this is it's not exactly an obscure letter, but it's a letter that I don't see quoted an awful lot when people talk about the Mahatmas. Well, she says, I told him, she's talking about Alcott, the whole truth. I said to him that I had known adepts not only in India and beyond Ladakh, but in Egypt and Syria. The names of the Mahatmas were not even known at the time, since they are called so only in India. Whether they were called Rosicrucians, Kabbalists, or Yogis, adepts were everywhere adepts. Silent, secret, retiring, and who would never divulge themselves entirely to anyone unless one did as I did, passed 7 and 10 years probation and given proofs of absolute devotion. All I was allowed to say was the truth. There is beyond the Himalayas a nucleus of adepts of various nationalities, and the Teshu Lama knows them, some remaining unknown even to the average lamas, who are ignorant fools mostly. My master and KH are there, coming and going, and they are all in communication with adepts in Egypt and Syria and even Europe. Now in the key, following on from her instruction on mermaids, she says, they are living men, born as we are born, and doomed to die like every other mortal. Although she's willing to qualify the extent of a normal life in their case, extending the years. We call them masters because they are our teachers, and because from them we have derived all the theosophical truths, however inadequately some of us may have expressed and others understood them. Now, that brings out one of the paradoxes of theosophy. Because theosophy as a term means divine wisdom, and there's very often an emphasis upon our own personal understanding and our own personal growth towards truth and all of that. Yes, I think we all see nice nods. Always nice to see people nodding. But ultimately, although we sometimes distinguish ourselves from movements which claim or base themselves upon revelation, I would defy anybody, if Madame Blavatsky had not started this whole ball rolling, I would defy anybody in this room to say they could have gone over the material that she went over and produced things like the Secret Doctrine. I know that I couldn't do it. So ultimately, although on the one hand we're not supposed to take things on trust, it's supposed to be theosophy as direct knowledge, on the other hand we do have to bring in a realization, and it's the gratitude of the student, this is my opinion, the gratitude of the student to the teacher, that what has actually started us off, what has brought us here, is something that is a gift to us. It is a revelation to us. And we approach the teachings with that in mind. Now, how did the masters view themselves and their teaching? Of course, our two principal original sources, first generation sources, so to speak, are Madame Blavatsky and the Mahatma letters, although some have challenged these. For example, Bishop Leadbeater is reported, there's no direct quote, but it's a reported quotation, to have disliked the Mahatma Letters book because they were published, and not originally by the Theosophical Society, incidentally, to counter his influence in the movement. The letters, of course, themselves state that they were not intended for publication or public consumption, due to the limitations on what could be taught and said in them. But it's a fact of history now, and Leslie reminded us of the importance of theosophical history, and this is, I think, one sense in which he didn't think of. They're there now. The historical publication of the Mahatma Letters happens, and we have them, and we can access them, because remember, in the early days of the Theosophical Society, you couldn't buy the Mahatma Letters. What they were copied by hand and passed among students, select few. And you had to be in the right circles to have access to the Mahatma Letters. And all that changed in 1923. So there they are. And if Sinnett could work out a reasonable account of theosophy from them in his esoteric Buddhism, the path is open to us all, I suppose. And also, it's worth bearing in mind that the letters explicitly claim that the secret doctrine will be the last word on many disputed subjects, because they had disputed subjects even in those halcyon days of the foundation of the movement, including many themes that Sinnett subsequently bequeathed to Besant and Leadbeater. Now, theosophy, say the masters, is no new candidate for the world's attention, but only the restatement of principles which have been recognised from the very infancy of mankind. And that is a clear statement of Theosophia, divine wisdom, an expression of direct experience of a reality beyond that limited to sense experience. And that is the key. It's not only is it a direct experience, we all have direct experiences. Right now I'm having a direct experience of this podium wobbling slightly when I rest on it and so on. You know, we all have direct experiences. And we all have personal opinions. But what's the theos in theosophy is divine. It is a divine reality. It's not an opinion, it's a divine reality. So we do need to ask, is there a distinction between theosophia and subjectivity? Is every experience valid? Do all inner states express equally valid points? Are there my truths and your truths, for example, which is a fairly popular or very common opinion that we encounter, not just in the Theosophical Society, because we seem to live in an age in which relativism is very much on the forefront. And the Masters and HPB did not seem to think so, as such. Quoting the Secret Doctrine, for example. The Secret Doctrine, says HPB, is the accumulated wisdom of the ages. The flashing gaze of those seers has penetrated into the very kernel of matter and recorded the soul of things there, where an ordinary profane would have perceived but the external work of form. The system in question is no fancy of one or several isolated individuals, but it is the uninterrupted record covering thousands of generations of seers whose respective experiences were made to test and to verify these traditions. No vision of one adept was accepted till it was checked and confirmed by the visions or independent evidence of other adepts and by centuries of experiences. It sounds sort of like a scientific project. It's like a Mahatmic laboratory. But what's one of the things there, I think the theme that comes from that is the body of knowledge, the philosophia perennis, rests upon numerous testimonies. If we restrict ourselves to one source only, then if that one source makes mistakes, then their mistakes are our mistakes. But if we read widely, then if we see various sources confirming, complementing, supplementing each other, then we have a body of testimony that certainly has some more certainty. It's obviously vox populi is not necessarily vox dei. The fact that a lot of people believe something doesn't mean it's automatically true, because there are people, large numbers of people other than theosophists who believe things, more people that believe things that we disagree with, and we don't bow down to them. There are probably more materialists in the world than there are theosophists or people of a spiritual bent, for example. I think the anthroposophical movement is bigger, so we're not all become anthroposophists. So it's not the case that the more is always right, but the more we go back into that central stream of a common tradition, the more we have a greater probability of actually dealing with something that's come down to us from antiquity and been proven by generations and generations and generations. And another aspect of that, of course, is that the philosophy claims to present a universal system, a system that's true throughout time and space. And what we need to do in our studies is relate our teachings to that common universal experience of humanity. And it's not theosophists in white coats in laboratories or psychic laboratories conducting psychic experiments and such. It's the universality of that tradition. So note here that she is suggesting an objective standard of some sort to judge just what the teaching is. And unless we are content to undertake our pursuit of divine truths within a bubble of solipsism, I think we can all see her point. If anyone claims that there is a reality transcending the physical and acting upon it, then that higher reality must in some sense be accessible to all who take the necessary means and succeed in approaching its mysteries. That there is a common foundation to religious experience is not a claim unique to theosophy. We're not the only ones that make that claim. Secular approaches to the spiritual, which see the numinous as examples of, for example, sociology or even abnormal psychology, and we've all seen enough abnormal psychology in theosophical meetings. But anyway, secular approaches to the spiritual, which see the numinous as examples of sociology or abnormal psychology, provide their own accounts. It is what exactly is identified as common that distinguishes any approach, secular, esoteric, whatever. For example, HPB claims a unified body of initiated teaching as her source. Again, say the sociological approach might just say what's common to religion is human beings have problems. They're faced with, from the hypothetical caveman sheltering in the cave with a woolly mammoth running around outside and thunder and lightning and providing this supernaturalist account. That's a sociological and a secular approach. So the idea that religion has a common foundation is not unique to us. What is our individual perspective, or the original perspective of theosophy, is this initiated body of teaching. What do we do when people who claim to have pierced the veil of the mysteries present different accounts of what they see there? Now, we can admit of differences in language, in psychology, in culture. That well-known phrase, saying the same thing in different words. But it would be lazy thinking to assume that this is always the case. KH tells Sinnett, for example, "I am sorry to contradict your statement. I know of no thousands of spirits who do appear in circles and teach the highest morality." And in discussing whether spirit communicators could differ in their ideas as embodied men do, for example, the blunt reply was, "Truth is one, and cannot admit of diametrically opposite views. We need to note the qualification in that phrase, diametrically. Diametrically, i.e., at the level of fundamental values, basic principles, there can be no contradiction. There can be contradiction or differences of interpretation or agreement over how that works out, how it all works out in practice, in the finer detail perhaps. But if one person comes up to you and says the universe is the expression of an underlying spiritual reality, and somebody else comes up and says the universe is a lump of matter, they're not. You can't combine the two, and that's an example of diametrically opposed viewpoints. A lesson we might learn is that no claim can be taken on its own terms, but has to be taken in context and contrasted with other sources claiming the same inspiration. A constant theme of the various letters is what we might call the beginning crisis of Western civilization, which seemed to lose its centre the moment it has established itself across the globe, and the criticism of what to the masters is a distorted spirituality. This is made clear in a letter to Laura Holloway, re the London Lodge. If Theosophists do their whole duty, the progress of materialism, the increase of dangerous self-indulgence, and the tendency towards spiritual suicide can be checked. The theory of vicarious atonement has brought about its inevitable reaction. Only the knowledge of karma can offset it. The pendulum has swung towards extreme materialistic skepticism, and nothing can stop it save theosophy. Think you the truth has been shown to you for your sole advantage? That we have broken the silence of centuries for the profit of a handful of dreamers only? Now, they were not uncritical of degeneration in Eastern traditions, but seemed to have an eye to the potentially devastating implications of future scientific discoveries in a culture cut loose from spiritual realities. And watching the news recently, and some of the bomb technology that's the ultimate product of modern science, and what's happening around Korea, or potentially could happen, you can see perhaps where the gist of their thought was going. So, Christianity comes in for special attention because the letters are talking to people in the West who are encountering the East for the first time, and not Easterners as such that are encountering Westerners for the first time. So Christianity comes in for special attention because it was the major faith in the West. But Blavatsky sometimes even demurred at the possibility of there being Christian theosophists, hedging it in with qualifying factors. The Mahachohan's letter addresses these issues. It begins with a rather stark statement. The doctrine we promulgate, being the only true one, must, supported by such evidence as we are preparing to give, become ultimately triumphant as every other truth. But Mahachohan then goes on to suggest that Colonel Olcott, in his work to revive Buddhism, quote unquote, stripped of its superstitions, was labouring, quote unquote, again in the truth path of theosophy, more so than many self-styled esotericists of the day. The letter further goes on to allow for a mystical Christianity in these terms. Osiris, Krishna, Buddha, Christ will be shown as different means to final bliss. For the masters teach, quote unquote, self-redemption through one's own seventh principle or liberated para-atma, or rebirth in spirit. At no point do the masters seem to suggest that they can do this for us, and HBB quotes Thomas Thorne approvingly in a first ever article for the Theosophist thus: a theosophist is one who gives you a theory of God or the works of God. It's probably one of the rare occasions when HBB actually used the word God in an approving sense. Or the works of God, which is not revelation but an inspiration of his own for its basis. One of the causes for disagreement in later theosophical history is just how that inspiration is defined and which inspirations are accepted and which are not. That's a vexed question, and it's one in which I don't think you can actually have a pre-established rule. Again, each individual case has to be tested individually. That's the only way you can do it. HBB asserts that the Masters do not guide the Theosophical Society, not even herself, but watch over and protect it. She references the fact that mistakes and scandals have not destroyed the movement. What is the difference between guidance and protection? Perhaps the latter is an occult claim, referring to the living force of an intellectual, moral and spiritual origin, providing continuous inspiration and support. The letter to Holloway quoted earlier mentions converging lines of karma connecting individuals to the Theosophical movement, and there is food for thought for us all here. HBB was certainly explicit on the possibility of future developments concerning material available to us in her esoteric papers. She said, "The time for such priceless acquisition of knowledge is limited. There remain but 12 years, i.e. to 1900, to the last hour of the term. No master of the wisdom from the East will appear or send anyone to Europe or America after that period, until the year 1975. The vexed question of 1975 again. Now this is a very stark statement with which later teachers have either had to contend with, if they've acknowledged it. I think Peruka pointed out that he was born in and not sent to the West, which seems to be maintaining the letter of the statement but not the spirit, or dismissed the source, as Steiner did. He claimed that HBB had been deluded by lesser grade adepts. With so many voices, even if we restrict it to those we personally happen to be familiar with, what criteria do we use in evaluating so many different claims? Simple platitudes that HBB is not the end of all knowledge are not enough to establish the claim of any subsequent teacher or school to advance her very specific teachings further. Madame Blavatsky never claimed to be the source of all esoteric knowledge. In fact, she was very cautious in some respects about how much esoteric wisdom could be given out, unlike the claims of some later individuals. The Buddha did give an example of how to identify authentic teachings. I know that the Buddha was not a member of the Theosophical Society, but is referred to in the Mahatma letters as the patron of all the adepts, so I think we can push the point, yeah? He said, "The qualities of which you may know, these qualities lead to passion, not to dispassion, to being fettered, not to being unfettered, to accumulating, not to shedding, to self-aggrandizement, not to modesty, to discontent, not to contentment, to entanglement, not to seclusion. You may categorically hold, this is not the teacher's instruction." So perhaps one criteria that we can apply to further teachings is, do they aggrandize the individual making them? Do they make apocalyptic claims, seem to offer what is too good to be true, or make what might be fantastic claims about the role of the brotherhood of whom the amanuensis is purported to be? In other words, you can use the double glazing criteria or the car insurance criteria. If somebody comes to your house selling double glazing or car insurance and they make a series of extravagant claims, would you accept it or shut the door on them? You'd shut the door on them. So why do we, when it comes to consumer goods, why do we have higher standards than we approach spiritual matters? I would have thought that the spiritual matters, our actual standards should be higher, and we should be very, very sparing and very scrutinizing. Are they personal or impersonal? And what is their orientation to the profane world? K.H. wrote to Hume that, quote unquote, "We never pretended to be able to draw nations in the mass to this or that crisis, in spite of the general drift of the world's cosmic relations. The cycles must run their rounds, and we, borne along on the mighty tide, can only modify and direct some of its minor currents." I would imagine that the issue of karma bulks very large here. Now compare two contrasting perspectives, one from K.H. to Sinnett, another from the teachings Alice Bailey attributes to D.K. In writing to Sinnett, K.H. characterises Hume thus: his is a bird-killing and a faith-killing temperament. He would sacrifice his own flesh and blood as remorselessly as a singing bulbul. In other words, the Mahatma didn't take too kindly to bird-killing, it seems. And notes a reference to Hume in one of the letters to Sinnett when he says, as regards his connection with theosophical matters, he is largely your jailer, the captive of your spear and bow. But since you have acted under my own instructions, I take the blame upon myself, and I would not allow a single speck of the present disastrous results to taint your karma, which suggests, and I've referenced in the past the work of Arthur Robson along these lines, which suggests that when we act under instruction, under somebody else's direction, the karma is not ours but theirs. Now consider this from Alice Bailey's externalization of the hierarchy, talking about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That atomic bomb ended the resistance of the powers of evil because its potency is predominantly etheric. The atomic bomb emerged from a first-ray ashram, and from the long-range point of view, its intent was and is purely beneficent. Now, personally, I find that a very odd statement, as I have thought that the hierarchy of compassion, as it is sometimes called, would hang its collective heads in despair when mankind goes to war. But we all have to make up our own minds, which means studying the sources, comparing them, and coming to our own point of view. The one thing I would say is that if that earlier quote from the Mahatma about their ability to influence the world is correct, then the idea that some later teachers seem to present of an inner government of the world, or a hierarchy directing things, it's just going back to the idea, the Christian idea, that God's created everything and everything's perfect. And it's denying the concept of karma and self-responsibility. That's my opinion anyway. The Mahatma let us raise the point about the danger of subjective factors clouding judgment. For example, so is Jesus and John the Baptist contacted by Edward Maitland, who is as honest and sincere as Staten Moses, while Mrs. Kingsford believes she saw and conversed with God. And she purer or more truthful than that woman, or Maitland. Mystery, mystery, you will exclaim. And this next word is in capitals. Ignorance, we answer. The creation that we believe in and want to see. Again, a letter to Holloway. Your vivid creative fancy evokes elusive gurus and chellas and puts into their mouths words coined the instant before in the mint of your mind, unknown to yourself. Was it Leslie that mentioned Edward Gardner, or was it Michael? It was Michael. I'm sorry to misattribute it, but unconscious Kriya Shakti. This is unconscious Kriya Shakti, and we wonder if Gardner got this from the Mahatma letters. Unknown to yourself. The false appears as real, and you have no exact method of detection, since you are yet prone to force your communications to agree with your preconceptions. So it seems sincerity is not enough. And this underlines the importance of study and disciplined study. And we should not be afraid to encounter in theosophical study ideas that we struggle to understand, and we may necessarily, perhaps virulently disagree with to begin with. If our path in study is easy and things fall in front of us as if we were, Alexander conquering vast swathes of the universe as we progress in thought, either we are very, very advanced, or we're just recreating the world in our own image. And I don't pretend to be very, very advanced. And this raises another question. Is it possible to escape any personal colouring to communications? Some people have suggested, for example, that HBB's hostility to Christianity distorted her appreciation of the potential benefits of this tradition, whilst others have made the reverse claim about Leadbeater. I think that the position we individually adopt on the issue will depend on the view we take of just what the nature of occult contacts are. We are used to the idea, for example, that Parabrahm, the absolute, is, as the phrase goes, beyond the range and reach of thought. So we may be inclined to take the leap that this means that truth itself is in some sense unmanifest, that the best we can hope for is a range of individual approximations, expressions of an inexpressible reality. But to me, this seems to fall into the trap of arguing that if we can't know everything, then we can't know anything. Therefore, one statement is as good as another. KH says in the so-called God letter, which is number 10 in the thematic 88, I think, in the chronological, my very dear brother, either we know something or we do not know anything. I suppose we can take it for granted that much of what Theosophy talks about is, unless we are adepts ourselves, realities of which we have no direct acquaintance. If I were to tell you that it is raining outside, you could easily verify my statement. But if I were to tell you that HBB said that there were 7 globes in a planetary chain, but Peruka said that there were really 12, what would we do? Does it matter? Aside from the issue of integrity, can we trust people who make extravagant claims which are not easily verified, and at least HBB tended to go back to traditional sources? There are other issues involved which I think basically fall into 2 categories. Firstly, many esoteric claims are about facts concerning either the natural world or human history, which are in principle capable of some form of verification, however imperfect. For example, either the gospel narratives are substantially true, as some have argued, or they are not. And we are all aware of the literature debating the merits of these 2 viewpoints. And it's possible at some point that, although there is a current academic consensus along one line, it's possible, theoretically possible, that at some point in the future, historical evidence, solid, substantial historical evidence, settling the issue one way or the other could be found. But these 2 different viewpoints have implications on practical levels, particularly for those schools which emphasize the saving power of an incarnate Christ. So if it were, for example, proven beyond any reasonable doubt that Christ was some kind of a solar myth and not a real person, not an opinion I hold myself, but if that were proven, then the system of anthroposophy, which rests upon what Steiner called the mystery of Golgotha and the changes to the etheric body of the planet caused by the shedding of Christ's blood, that system is suddenly starting to totter. Secondly, HBB suggests that we can use the principle of analogy to come to experience the teachings. For example, seeing cycles in operation in our daily lives and coming to understand these in an expression of much vaster cycles. So, we don't have daily life in one compartment of our minds and high metaphysics in another. We are supposed to integrate the 2. And this accounts, I think, for the Master's insistence on the detail of the teachings they gave us, because the whole system, as we have it, is intended to work together as a whole. It works on our intuition. Take note of what HBB says in the SD commentaries. Buddhi by itself can neither have intuition nor non-intuition nor anything. Intuition belongs to Manas. Now, when I first encountered Theosophical teachings, I very often came across the idea that the Buddhi is the intuition. But there's HBB saying that intuition is not Buddhi, but Manas. Now, the Manas she refers to here is the higher, which she refers elsewhere to as the Sutratman. And she says the manas is always the same. It is the stem around which cling the personalities. In its own inherent nature, it is omniscient, for it is part of the divine mind. But once it incarnates on earth, it takes up all the finite attributes and the qualities of the personalities it incarnates in. I did dredge up some lengthier quotations from this particular source. It's the Secret Doctrine Commentaries, transcribed and annotated by Michael Gomes. Although apparently here and there's the odd word that he couldn't work out. Oh, it's really not good enough, Michael. We expected 100%. But I would heartily recommend this book to everybody. And in this particular passage, other passages round about, where she discusses the nature of intuition and discusses things such as the Platonic method, it brings out just why does Theosophy lay so much emphasis upon teaching, and why do certain traditions within the broader Theosophical movement place so much emphasis upon the accuracy, the verbatim nature of the teachings and so on, whatever. And she talks about approaching Platonic universals in a discussion when they're talking about hierarchies, for example. She discusses the only way, she says, to actually understand these things is to get the broadest, most universal conception we can, the quality of universal, and then work it down. Which is why, incidentally, I suppose, the Secret Doctrine, much to our anguish, begins with discussions about the three fundamental propositions that Janet referred to yesterday. That is why the beginning of the Secret Doctrine is so abstract, because it starts at that universal level of the general principle and then it works it down. And she also goes on to suggest that what we're doing is we're not just talking about things, we actually need to unite our consciousness at this level. We need to link up. So the concepts that are presented in the Theosophical teachings, they're not words. They're not opinions as such. They don't claim to be opinions. You can regard them, anybody can regard them as opinions, but their self-identified claim is they're not opinions. Now remember, what is the one thing that we often say about the universe as Theosophists? It's big. It's all one what?
Energy.
Life, energy, or something beginning with M. Mind. Divine mind in expression, in action. So, if the universe is the expression of a divine mind, what are the basic building blocks of the universe? Thoughts. The thoughts. So, if we were a secularist, for example, or a materialist, we could say that thought is a secretion of matter. Thought is secondary, or we can use thoughts to liberate people and have all of this liberty and progress. But if we believe that the universe is the expression of a logos, manifest thought, then when we study, and we're using thought to study because we're using manas to study, we're actually engaging with the building blocks of the universe. And we are free to use these thoughts, but we're not free to choose them. We don't have free choice of the question of thoughts. If these are accurate descriptions of subjective realities, then they are what they are. In the same way that any materialist can't pick and choose which physical laws of the universe exist. I can't pick and choose. If I was Richard Dawkins, I can't pick and choose, well, I'm going to disbelieve in the law of gravity and jump off of a tower block, or I disbelieve in the law of buoyancy and I'll walk on water. We can't choose these laws. And similarly, in the laws of thought, in the laws of the interior, in the interiority of the subjectivity, we're not actually free to choose. Because when we deal with inner realities, we are dealing with something that, although it is subjective, has priority to us. It has ontological, thoughts have ontological primacy over us. So intuition is not a series of glamorous visions or dramatic episodes. It is the art of integrating our consciousness with the realm of the universal, the spiritual laws which are held to be behind the manifest. The teachings are designed to do that, we're told. HBB quotes the Master in her ES paper, number 5, so posthumously, that the great difficulty to be overcome is the registration of the knowledge of the higher self on the physical plane. To accomplish this, the physical brain must be made an entire blank to all but the higher consciousness. And how do we do that? Other than by drinking deep at the well of divine wisdom that the Masters have given to us. The rest is up to us. Now, thank you. I have one little appendix which came to me yesterday. And it's following on from Michael's talk on Wednesday. Was it Wednesday? Tuesday? It all becomes a blur, doesn't it? Only the breakfasts stand out. Only the meals stand out. When Michael was referencing about the absolute becoming conscious via ourselves, I'm calling it his quasi-Hegelian moment. And I was reading the day after, actually, or was it yesterday? I can't remember. This book, The Apprentices by Leon Garfield, which is a children's book of short stories. He's perhaps best known for writing a story called Black Jack, which was made into a very good movie by Ken Loach. And this is from the story Tom Titmarch's Devil. In the beginning, whispered the preacher, in the very beginning, that is, God made the devil, and that was his greatest creation. When he made the devil, he made himself, because before there was the devil, there was no God. Before there was evil, there was no good. Then he made darkness to make light, because without darkness, there can be no light. Nothing can exist of itself alone. He thought of guilt so that he might create innocence. He caused Cain to kill Abel. He caused Judas to betray Christ. Without Cain, there is no Abel. Without Judas, there is no Christ. Without guilt, there is no innocence. Without agony, there is no joy. And that's from a children's book. And sometimes, do we need the secret doctrine? Anyway, I think I'd like to thank you for listening.